All right, welcome to PFX. This is the first class, and it's going to be called Overview of the Psychic Arts. Um, so my name is Vice again, and I'm going to also give Nandini a chance to introduce themselves once they pop back in. My pronouns are they and them, and I'm teaming up with Triple Goddess Tarot in order to do this basic kind of foundational class for psychic abilities and kind of give everyone the tools that I've had access to and that Nandini and everybody from the collective has had access to in order to kind of build up our intuition and abilities to the point that we're at now where we're able to offer them in service to other people. It just has been a super enriching part of my life ever since I started studying these types of things. And all the information is really just, it's out there and it's available. So what I'm really doing here, what I'm trying to do is just kind of create a compendium or a library where we can all pool our links together and just share the information. So it's nothing new here really. And it's all stuff that's been said before, but I'm just kind of packaging it in a way that is maybe more appealing to certain people in my communities, or the people that I feel have not always been so attracted to this kind of topic. And I'm going to address why really quickly in a little bit, but I wanted to start with this idea that like everyone is psychic. It's not like, Nandini or I or Duria or Ricky or anyone here is actually like, more gifted than anyone else. It's really just a matter of like practice and education. Everybody has gut feelings, everybody has dreams, intuitions, like feelings that they, like if sometimes you walk into a room and you just feel like something really nasty has happened in it. Everybody's had those kinds of intuitive hits before. So we all actually are capable of these kinds of things. And it's also proven in the way that like we can know how other people feel, especially in, if you're taking psychedelics or if you're in, like a party, like a dance floor setting, like it's very obvious that you can't deny the fact that like you're feeling something on a collective level. There's information traveling, across people and cross minds. Minha's asking me, would you prefer we keep our cameras off or on? I don't really care for now. It's up to you. Just know that you're not going to show up in the video as long as you're muted. And then once we go into the group portion, if you want to participate, you can. If you want to just sit back, you can. Camera on or off, it's really totally up to you. And yeah, so I was saying.
I'll actually stop recording once we do sharing and things like that if you're gonna do group portions, and that way I'll have a file that I can share that just has you explaining your class and courses, and then you'll have one just for your private archives too.
Okay, perfect.
If you want to do that. That way we can be able to turn things on and everyone can like restore their privacy.
Yes, perfect. Nandini, now that you're here, do you want to talk a little bit about yourself before I move forward?
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Nandini. I'm the Shakti Oracle on Instagram. I put a lot of info in the box. Hopefully everyone can see it. Just about where to connect to Lalith and I and Triple Goddess Tarot. And so Triple Goddess Tarot is just a collective of QTPOC, BIPOC, and allies that are it's a healing arts collective. It's really like the simplest way I can express it because there's just so much like dynamic growth in there that there isn't any other way. Like if we really started to like break it down on what we're doing, I think we would box it in too much because it's so much growth. And everyone that participates is a healer, an artist, you know, just discovering so much that that they've begun to unfold from like a deeper practice, I think. And so it's really special to be a part of this and to witness. And there's a lot of info on the website, but I really encourage you to reach out to everybody that does work with Triple Goddess Tarot, like just to talk to us and just connect, because that's where you really get the magic, is in the personal interactions and like showing up for the workshops, because it's in the moment. It's always in the moment. That's where it's really going down. So hopefully you enjoy this workshop. If you want to ask any questions, please keep them in the chat box for now, unless we're doing this sharing portion. And if you want to interact with each other, to just be respectful, to ask first before you reach out to anyone that's here, because some folks might just be here to receive and might not feel comfortable to communicate at this time. And yeah, hopefully you have a good time and you get something out of this. And I'm super excited for it. So thank you, Lalit.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just like, ah, I love this person. I love this whole project that we're doing. So like, I haven't felt this excited about something for a while. But yeah, so like I was saying, you know, we've been making connections with each other, especially during this quarantine, and really kind of finding out so much more about ourselves and our abilities, and like having this forum with each other to be able to sort of build ourselves up. And I think that that's just a beautiful thing that like should really be extended to everyone else in our communities, because we're all connected to, and we all serve so many people who are so magical in themselves. And I really feel this kind of paradigm shift that's coming that I'm actually going to get to in my talk. So I wanted to go over first like the psychic arts and how they've changed in the view of history. So classically, you know, in a lot of like ancient civilizations that are recorded that we generally agree on having existed, um, you know, people have at like very high levels of society consulted with oracles and shamans and healers, people who have access to 3D plus dimensions of information, right? And they're skilled practitioners, and you know, it would be anybody who kind of was in a dire situation and needed some sort of intervention or wisdom from a seer, from a higher power, would go and consult this oracle. And you know, famously, there's the Oracle of Delphi, and you know, that dates to 1200 BC. You know, before that, there were oracle bones. Sorry, am I disconnecting? Oracle bones used in China, 1600 BC. Egypt and Assyria way before that, and you know, this is like a very long-standing tradition. And it was something that used to really be at the backbone of how a lot of human civilizations functioned. A lot of really high level people would make their decisions based on this kind of information. So what happened now, or what, you know, between then and now, like a lot has happened to really change the way that people view psychic arts. And I think that there has been a whole like full circle kind of effect, because, you know, there at some point was what we call in the West the scientific revolution or the Enlightenment era. And this is kind of when you start to see that like people really started to discredit any kind of polytheistic thinking or you know, goddess worship, anything involving sacrifices, etc., or like magic and ritual, as irrational, unscientific, or religious. And you know, this was when you started to see this like division between church and state in the West. But you know, what came with this was also like the dismissal of anything that seemed to be non-rational, non-linear, hysterical. You know, there was also the beginning of stigmatization of mental illnesses that was very largely racist and sexist in the ways that we, you know, started to pathologize like just this, like the very like common behavior of women. And you know, and a lot of oracles in the days before that were in female bodies. So you know, something interesting to note. But we call this the Enlightenment era, and this was also when we started to view in the West like primitive religions and cultures as like diluted and backwards, and we called them primitive, which is like, I think, such a problematic term in itself, because there were a lot of things that, like, even though a lot of medical science was progressed and a lot of important ideas were forwarded during the Enlightenment era, there was also a lot of new dogma that was basically being introduced that was just replacing the dogma of the Catholic Church before that. And in Europe, it was just, there's this whole saga of like this duality between church and state. Um, there's a speech that was made in 1997 by someone named Stephen Jay Gould, and it was called his theory of non-overlapping magisteria, because especially after all of the debates around evolution and Darwinism versus creationism, people were really experiencing a huge like cognitive dissonance around, like 80 to 90% of Americans still believed in God or like some kind of higher power. But at the same time, like we all very much, felt that the idea of evolution and Darwinism was compelling. And so it's always been this very strange thing that, most people just don't really kind of go into the realm of like reconciling their religious beliefs with their adherence to modern science. And NOMA, or non-overlapping magisteria, was a way for this person to basically say, like, we can just compartmentalize all of those different fields, and not have them compete with each other, which I think is useful for certain things and for certain intellectual progress that needed to be made at the time, but it's also problematic in certain ways. And a lot of like basically pioneers in the history of science would totally disagree. A lot of the origins of what we now know as natural sciences, like chemistry and physics, really came from people who were polymaths and people who were actually deeply spiritual or religious in some way. People who didn't see their work as belonging to just like one magisterium or another, like they were actually involved and intersecting so many different things at once. So and they were also always kind of on the forefront of like, there was always some kind of like mystical proponent, like component of their work that other people kind of didn't accept or understand about what they were doing, but they also, ended up being very innovative and coming up with very effective and useful ideas for science, and sort of changing the perspective of what is considered scientific, changing the view of like what we accept as objective, scientific, rational inquiry. So, one really good example of this is Galileo. And, in 1609, he wrote Sidereus Nuncius, which was his findings of like basically like 2 years before that, like the telescope was invented. He was one of the first people to point it at the skies, and he actually improved the model of the telescope by like grinding his own lenses, and he built his own models, and like just like wrote down and drew very faithfully as like with like the skill of an actual like artist or draftsman, everything that he saw, including like the textures of like mountains that he thought were on the moon, because he could see them, and he could also triangulate by the shading of it and what he could see with the telescope, that there was a depth variation on the moon, which really challenged this idea back then that like all the celestial bodies were these like perfect spheres. And it also challenged the idea, like he was basically able to see it as fact, that Copernicus was right, which was that the earth revolves around the sun, which was extremely blasphemous because the Catholic Church at that point believed that the everything revolved around the earth. And, you know, they were like, how could, you know, how could a perfect God make such an imperfect, you know, design where like everything doesn't revolve around us, you know, that kind of stuff. So just something to think about when we kind of when we investigate like what it is that we accept as fact, because it really is just some person's idea of what is objective that, you know, ends up being adopted by everyone else. So I wanted to just talk about that because there's so much skeptical cynicism, you know, around what psychic abilities are, but there's also so much proof, and not even proof, but just like, you know, it depends what kind of anecdotal, what kind of evidence you consider real. Like there's so much anecdotal evidence and there's so much historical evidence, and yet it's still something that we really have trouble accepting. And even if we have those experiences ourselves, you know, in, you know, mystical states or trance states, altered states of consciousness, like we still have that thing in the back of our heads that makes us doubt or like think that we're crazy. And you know, this is all, you can really trace it to kind of like conspiracy theories, honestly, or just ways that like essentially like imperial culture, like white man culture has tried to make this seem like something that is unreal, and it's really just a huge gaslight. um so yeah, like in the West though, we do have certain movements that did take hold, that did start to sort of shift the tides of what we of like where we are now, where the tide has risen, where I think we're in a place where we're actually a lot more ready to accept and investigate the idea of psychic abilities now, because of things like well, there's always been a tradition, but it's always been very repressed and underground for a lot of good reasons, but it's been continuous. um, you know, Pythagoras and Empedocles were Greek philosophers whose foundational work is still really important in understanding psychic abilities now. There was also theosophy, telema, and spiritualism after that, like actually like during the Enlightenment era, where people were using clairvoyance to investigate like subatomic particles and have seances, connect with the dead, etc. They were all multidisciplinary by nature. And they were all very much like rejected during their time. But now we see people kind of going back to the work of like Crowley and Blavatsky and all of these like spiritualists. And now we also see, I think, after the wars and after Freud and Jung, that like there's a lot of compelling, um, there's a lot of compellingness or whatever force to the idea that, you know, the psychic world is real, only for the sole reason, if only for the reason that like it has a real effect on human behavior, and that is why we kind of have to, you know, consider it real, because it's just very effective. Actually, it works to think of it as real. The psyche is real, the soul is real, and you know, when we actually attack ourselves, or not attack, but like, you know, try to affect change on that level, it can be very effective. And so, you know, now we're starting to kind of come back around um, to when it comes to just like the objective line of inquiry, like deciding whether, you know, psychology is a real science, especially now that, you know, governments and corporations are obviously withholding information from us, and we are like becoming more mentally ill than ever before. um, it's just, it's time that we stopped letting these institutions tell us what we can and can't know. um, and it's time that we ask questions again about like, you know, what constitutes really like asking a question and getting an answer. And what are the things that stand in the way of that? And I think we can try to be as objective as we can, but there's still so much at this point also with how mediated we are and how full our psyches are with propaganda, essentially, and media that's controlled by the state and by corporations. It's a really difficult process, actually, of like reassessing where all of our ideas come from, what our reality is based on, and how much of it is still subscribed to a very much imperialist and racist and xenophobic worldview. Because if we go through, if you trace it back in history, all of this stuff was just clearly like a means of control. And so yeah, it's very empowering if you think about it, how we can just analyze how we otherize and separate ourselves from each other and from other ways of thinking. And it's really out of fear, because I think the institutions do this because they don't want people to be empowered. And that's part of why education has been so suppressed for so long. And that's why we have things like witch hunts and stigmas around mental illness. And, it's just like, I don't know, this is really powerful stuff, which is my point. None of you want to add something, or does anybody, I would say I want to limit it to the Triple Goddess collective in case you wanted to add any more quick facts to that portion. And then I'm gonna move on to just like stuff about the course. Okay, so let me just keep going. So yeah, we're in a time where I think more and more people are starting to turn to the New Age and spiritual movements, whether in the form of self-help, books and recordings, guided meditation, things like that. That's an industry that's growing really quickly. We're also much more accepting of like alternative therapies, like holistic therapies, things like past life regression, hypnosis, psychedelic treatment, psychoanalysis, things that used to actually be very avant-garde. So it's a really promising time to be, and I think that this was also this is like the things that are happening today have also really been predicted by a lot of these like ancient societies that used to rely heavily on oracles and divination and seers. This is a time where in the Vedas, like, it was predicted that like humans would be at their most spiritually depraved, like they would be the most lost from their initial state and from their state of being and knowing in their full power. And what happens is, like, once that goes to an extreme, it basically turns back in the other direction. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing in this, when like so many people, like, all of these say psychic spiritual topics have had to be forced underground, and then it's kind of just like erupting back. And and I'm going to link to Thomas Kuhn's book here, Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And this is a really cool book. It's talking about basically what I've just been describing, that there's a pattern to how people come to, at large, like accept, like start by rejecting and then accepting certain ideas that are scientific, but that just don't feel scientific to them at the time. Because it just takes time for us to transition. And we are, according to scriptures and according to this like ancient wisdom, endowed with free will. And while there are cycles in history, like it's not all written. Like, while there are things that we can predict, it's not all set in stone. So, you know, it's really important that we take it into our hands what happens next, as far as like, you know, this moment in time. So instead of going to the oracle, instead of going to the healers, I mean, you're welcome to do that because that's, you know, kind of our jobs and that's what we like to do. But the idea with this course is really that like you're going to become your own best practitioner, your own oracle, your own healer. Um, and this is something that I think is more possible now than ever. And it's just that there's so many people now who are actually walking around already with intensely like strong abilities and gifts, but they just don't necessarily think of it that way. And sometimes it's just stuff that they've been doing forever. They don't even realize it. So, you know, unintentionally or unconsciously, you might be like a day trader who just happens to know when is the right time to buy or sell. You might be a gambling savant. You might be, you know, a really talented cop, you know, or something like that. Like there's just so many people who are walking around who like have all these things they can't explain. But I think there's a lot of power in kind of learning to pinpoint what it is, how it is that information comes to you, sort of slowing down the process and trying to expand it basically and open up that channel of information just to be a little bit more conscious of it. Because what also can happen is that like you could be using these talents for your benefit. It might be like it might actually be harming other people, which ends up harming you in return eventually. You might even be using these abilities to actually like manipulate other people or prey on other sexual energy and things like that. There's a lot of that happening. So it's just like thinking about it more and having a place to talk about it is going to be really good for building up just like the foundational worldview around it that's going to help you use it to your advantage. Like everybody is psychic, but not everybody is spiritual. And I mean, we all are spiritual, but like I think what being consciously spiritual means is kind of applying the need for an ethical grounding, like a moral compass to it, and sort of like contextualizing your psychicness and your spiritual existence in a worldview that demands a certain responsibility from you just because of the power that you have. You know, because information is just information and it just really depends what you do with it. So the more you know, the more you're able to be responsible. So yeah, it's never too late to learn, you know, and there's so many different forms of using psychic abilities. You could be a reader, which means receiving information, retrieving it, medium, which means communicating with like other planes and other entities who are not physical, shamanism, which is like healing or being an agent of karma, alchemy, sorry, transforming matter across planes, which is like what yoga falls under, qigong falls under. Qigong also is very closely related to martial arts and kung fu. And I wanted to, last topic, go into the basics of like how we're going to deal with this idea of like the dark side, because I think this is a really vast topic, and this is obviously something that has had so many thousands of years of thought put into it, like, and across so many different moments of human history. So there's a lot of gray areas. It's actually like I feel like this whole field of study is like just defined by being a gray area in itself. So there is, you know, we're going to come up against this idea of good and bad. We're going to come up against the fact that like, you know, people who, there is a dark side. This is like becoming a Jedi, like, and you do have to really be willing to open your mind to, you know, the gray areas of morality that are going to be involved here. And just think of it as a thought experiment. And because there is so much in this kind of dark and light, good and evil dichotomy that is very rigid and like doesn't actually serve us, and you have to kind of always try to trace things back to where they come from. And yeah, like for example, in martial arts and in Chinese alchemy and Chinese spiritualism, you know, it's considered a very high art. It's considered like a very spiritual thing actually to become a very effective warrior or fighter. And I think this is kind of like one of the stereotypical points of discrepancy for a lot of people who want to be spiritual, and then they're like, wait, but like doesn't that mean, doesn't being spiritual mean like being peaceful, or being like really good and like just not hurting anyone ever? Well, on a certain level, yes. And also on another level, there's just so much nuance to it. Like it depends on the situation, depends on the context. Like sometimes like things do have to be fought for. And I think most people, of any kind of like marginalized identity can understand that really easily. But yeah, power can be abused. So it's really important to keep this in mind. And it's really important that, that we in this group are teaching how to ask questions and think critically rather than kind of asking you to absorb any of our, you know, moral implications. And yeah, it's also really useful to have this cross-cultural reference because in Chinese and Taoist philosophy, yin and yang are two parts of the same coin. You always have dark and light that need to be coexistent and to balance each other out. So yeah, as we go through the syllabus, you're going to see that there's a few different types of courses. For the first 7 weeks that we have the same meeting ID and password, it's all going to be foundations. So it's all going to consist of basically a lecture and then a group portion afterwards. And it's going to be pretty lax. And then afterwards, you'll see there's so many different kinds of topics, and they're going to be either foundations, activations, or master classes. So any of those can be taught by any, collection of people. Nandini and I will just be in charge of, like, if you're interested in being a speaker for any of these things, please reach out, and then we can like have a few weeks in advance to decide on a date and decide on how we want to form this lecture together and do group exercises. And yeah, so please give us your input. I'm really interested to know what you want to learn and what we can provide, and also what you would want to teach. It's going to be really important in our group sessions that everybody conducts themselves with respect. You will be kicked out if you are doing anything that we think is inappropriate, or you're just not acting respectfully towards other people. The last thing we want is for any kind of holier than thou hierarchy to start happening. So yeah, this is really just about sharing information and raising our vibration. And I'm going to talk about what that really means as we go forward. And continue to check back at scifx.info for more materials and PDFs that we might want to share, etc. Yeah, the point is really for us to practice having an open mind, and that's really the key to any kind of work when it comes to like third eye stuff and retrieving information. It's all about having a soft focus and really kind of being able to keep a lot of different nuanced, and maybe even opposing ideas in mind all at once, and to just really kind of broaden our view of things. We're entering, an environment of thought experiment. And actually, like, we exist in a thought experiment, and that's just what we're remembering and becoming conscious of at this time. So please remember to take everything with a grain of salt. It's really important. Like, the whole point is for you to, like, not become dependent on anybody else for these kinds of knowledge, and for you to kind of use other people as a mirror to understand more about yourself and the ways that, like, you can strengthen your connection to your own divinity, and your own source of, irrefutable knowledge. And I think that's it. Yeah, Nandini, do you want to pop in?
Yeah. Wow. I'm amazed, and I love everything that you talked about. It was like the psychic review that I needed right now. I love your brain, and I I was really connected to talking about hearing you talk about like warriorship and the shadow energy that we work with, and how being like does have a place in this world. There are people, there are cultures and practices that honor that, and to remember that and restore that, to know that there have been people passing down the practices that we need for that is really important for me to hear. Because as a person who, I think a lot of people that awaken to their psychic senses more and more, to their subtle energies, and experience their spiritual power, often have like really difficult childhoods or experiences in life that they kind of needed those tools for, so it's kind of like where we learn about time travel, I think, at some point in the journey, where we're like, okay, now I can go back and like heal my younger self, using the things that I'm awakening to, that I've always had, and that we all always have, and that we need to awaken to through getting those layers off of us to our subtle senses, and using those techniques and tools to train the subtle senses to do that. And when I'm hearing that, it's like kind of like ringing true to why I work so much with Kali, and why I feel so like this like undying like devotion, like I'll stand up for her name no matter what. And that there's a lot of negativity towards her name, I think, because people are just like, and even people who come from South Asian cultures that are like, what the hell, like Kali worship is too intense, and like this and this will happen to you, and that fear comes from the fear of facing that part of us that is capable of being the warrior. And also that when we're raised in difficult situations, we might have acted out. And I know I have, like, definitely, like I have a history that I share openly with like addiction and things like that. So I've had a lot of years of acting out, and finding the difference between like acting out and warriorship is so valuable and important. I think we often see violence in ourselves and others that make us afraid to learn how to be a warrior. But the warrior aspect is what makes us train that thing. I talked about this in the Bija group the other night, was actually like, it's like carrying a really heavy sword, but being a baby, and you're like trying to carry this like really heavy thing, and you have to strengthen those psychic muscles to do it. And the warrior training, and when acknowledging that you're a warrior, helps you to put yourself in that training, in those spaces with those teachers, with that knowledge, under those ascended masters or physical masters that you need, in whatever forms they come to you. When I say masters, it's not like, I used to like just associate it with like the typical like masculine, like, assigned male at birth, like guru style. But it's like your guru can be so many things, so many beings.
Yeah.
And your teachers are literally in everybody. So that's part of, I think, my path with Kali too, is that she always reminds me that you're learning all the time. So don't think that you're not, even when it's challenging, even when it's
Totally.
people that are.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
part of why I wanted to give that historical context too is because, Kali is very associated with, she is a black-skinned deity. She's worshipped by people who are very low caste and often very dark skin in South India. You know, my grandfather was born in her cult, and he immigrated to Myanmar, where he was very much just persecuted for it. Like he was not really, just everybody was just really racist towards him, and his entire culture. And it's just like, it's obviously just, it's like, who does it benefit to scapegoat those people, or to paint them as, you know, Kali and all of her followers as evil, you know, as like the dark side. It's just like such a clear, I don't know. It's like once you really kind of ask for yourself what that really is about, is this really evil? You know, you feel such a different thing, having just kind of the ability to ask that question with open arms, without any attachment, you know, without any fear. Um, and you know, it's also like understanding how much like the gradient, it's really just a gradient. Like nothing about connecting with any of these deities or energies is really that like supernatural. It's just, it's actually really natural, and it's just a matter of like the scale of perception that you're looking at. Like how subtle do you want to go, how much focus do you want to give, um you know, to certain like mental actions. um there's nothing like, there's nothing like that mysterious or like mystical about it. It just, it's just a type of attention span that I think like we've started to kind of lose, and like it started to atrophy the more we kind of settle into our sedentary like TV watching lifestyle.
I think Julian wanted to add some things if you
Yeah,
have a
for
little
sure.
time to.
Yeah, I thought that first and foremost, thank you. I thought that your talk was really amazing. And I really enjoyed you kind of like rooting it in this kind of like historical narrative of like what has been the role of people that have awakened these abilities inside of themselves in society at various stages. Because I think that like, you know, whether it's through what appears to be like an accident or like intentional cultivation, these types of consciousness kind of develop, and then it's sort of like, what do you do with it, and like, who are you, and how does this fit into my life, and how does my life fit into the bigger picture of society? Like, what is my purpose? Um, and I think that's like a question that we all really like grapple a lot. So tradition of people that have had these kinds of consciousness, I think, is really important because it helps us to hone in on like how we find our piece of the puzzle in today's world. That may not necessarily give us a pre-written position, but I think that we can sort of make anything that we do infused or informed by our spiritual consciousness. So I thought that that was really great.
Thank
Um,
you. Yes. Yeah, so this was hopefully, you know, something that gives you something to think about, and, you know, think like gets you to maybe come back for another course, or just like look at the calendar and see what you might be interested in joining for in the future, you know, consider how you might want to be involved in the future. Um, and yeah, so the next, I'm about to stop the recording, so let me just do the last plugs. Like our next class is going to be also on Wednesday. Also, by the way, happy Earth Day. And yeah, the next one is going to be yoga and meditation. So I find that topic to be completely fundamental to going forward with any psychic abilities. You have to understand deeply like what is yoga, and that's just one word, you know, that's just going to be my lens, one way of going into what uh, you know, knowledge and spirituality really are grounded in for me. And meditation, I think whatever, you know, background you're coming from, whether you call it yoga or not, like meditation is meditation, and it's going to be crucial, and it's like the discipline that I think strengthens your abilities the most. So that's going to be our next topic. And I'm going to end the recording now. So thank you so much for being here, and we're going to go into the group discussion now.